4. But is law the right subject for me? Dear Alex, you're quite right. I did say in my first letter to you that law isn't for everyone. Doing well as a law student requires a specific set of skills, and not everyone has those skills. In fact, I think the number of 17 or 18-year-olds who have a natural aptitude for studying law is gradually getting smaller and smaller. I think that's down to a combination of two things. One, I think the sort of society we live in doesn't really encourage children to develop the kind of skills that they need to have if they are to do well as law students. Two, people of your age don't really know what sort of skills successful law students need to have, and so have no idea that they need to work on themselves to develop those skills. But the good news is that most of the skills I'll be talking about in this letter can be acquired, if you want to develop them. So doing well in studying law shouldn't be beyond anyone. Whether someone does well or not depends on whether they want to become the sort of person who can do well at law. Not everyone does, and it follows that law isn't for them. So what I'll do in this letter is set out 12 qualities that I think are important for a law student to have, if they are going to do well in their studies. I'll also give you some tips as to how you can develop these qualities if you don't have them already. And then you can think about how many of these qualities you have already, and whether you are prepared to do what it takes to acquire the others. Here we go. 1. Self-belief. Henry Ford had a saying, "Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're probably right." In other words, you won't be able to do anything that you don't believe you can do. This applies in spades to studying law. Law is very different from any other subject you will have studied so far, including law A level, if that's one of your A levels. There are going to be times when you are going to feel that law is so strange and unfamiliar that it is never going to make sense. It will, eventually, but to get to the other side, where the law becomes much more comprehensible, you will need to believe that you have what it takes to get to the other side. So how do you develop a belief in yourself or your abilities if you don't have it already? In his closing address to the jury in the film, The Verdict, Paul Newman's character says, "In my religion they say, act as if ye had faith. Faith will be given to you." Aaron Sorkin later borrowed this line for The West Wing. Jed Bartlett is running for president and confesses to his campaign manager, Leo McGarry, that he isn't sure that he's the right man to become president. Leo replies, "Act as if ye have faith, and faith shall be given to you." Put it another way, fake it till you make it. If you lack faith in yourself, it doesn't really matter. Just act as though you did do whatever you would do if you believed in yourself. And when things eventually come right, you'll see that you should have believed in yourself all along, and that will stand you in good stead the next time the chips are down. 2. Sang-froid. Sang-froid literally means cold blood. Someone with sang-froid is able to stay cool and composed under pressure. I think sang-froid is a very important quality for a law student, particularly at the start of one's studies. When you are starting out as a law student, you come under a seemingly relentless barrage of information that you have to master, and you are expected to be able to do so many new things, such as read a case or write an essay about the law in such a short period of time. In order to come through this blooding relatively unscathed, you need to be able to keep cool, focus on what needs to be done, and get on with doing it. Acquiring sang-froid is just a matter of deliberately not looking at the bigger picture, of breaking everything you need to do down into much smaller steps, and then focusing relentlessly on the little steps you need to make, and not thinking about how far you have to go or how much more you have to do. I write a very big textbook on a particular area of law, and the textbook is about 1,000 pages long. When I started out writing the textbook, if I had ever thought about how long it was going to be, I would never have been able to write it. I would have been overwhelmed by the sheer size of the task. But by focusing on writing one page or one chapter, and always just focusing on that, it was eventually finished, and pretty quickly too. 3. Organization. The last point takes me on to the next quality required to be successful as a law student: the need to be organized. Look at this letter or my 3 previous letters. Look at how they are laid out, with headings and subheadings, and with some kind of order between the various different headings. Look at how, whenever I set out a list of points, I number each point. The way I write is a reflection of my personality, which is very organized and methodical in its approach to everything. I think that this is an important quality that anyone who wants to be successful as a law student needs to have. I'm definitely not saying that spontaneity and a bit of messiness in your thinking won't be valuable to you as a law student. People who only think in straight lines aren't capable of seeing the indirect connections that exist between different ideas and subjects. But in the end, you won't be able to express yourself clearly as a law student. Remember the iron rule of lawyering. Express yourself clearly or die if you can't organize your thoughts. And you won't be able to cope with all the demands that studying law makes on you if you can't organize your time. If you are a pretty disorganized person, and most teenagers are, the secret to changing that is again to act as though you are an organized person. If you do that for long enough, being organized will become the norm for you, and you will gradually become intolerant of disorganization. So tidy up your room and make an effort to keep it tidy. Start making lists of things you have to do and check them off as you do them, and make sure you do everything on your list. Take pride in any work you do for school and make it look classy. Take on jobs that require a lot of planning and organization to be done properly, such as helping out backstage in a school drama production, and make sure no one has reason to criticize your performance. 4. Focus. The great French philosopher and mathematician, Blaise Pascal, once remarked that the sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room. Whether that's true or not of mankind generally, I tend to think it is. It's definitely true of law students. Any student who is restless and easily distracted will tend not to do very well in studying law. Focus is vital for a law student, the ability to work for sustained periods of time, concentrating on difficult legal issues that require sustained attention before they will yield and become comprehensible. Unfortunately, focus is something in small supply nowadays among students your age. There are so many distractions available to you, particularly from your computer and your mobile phone, that it is hard just to stay still for a long period of time and give your full attention to just one thing. Your capacity to focus is like a muscle. The more exercise it gets, the stronger it gets. It follows that if you suffer from a weak attention span, the way to deal with that is to isolate yourself from possible sources of distraction, so that the only thing you can focus on is whatever you are supposed to be paying attention to. So if you can't focus on your work because Facebook or YouTube are constantly calling to you, you need to work somewhere that you don't have access to those things. Gradually, the more you allow yourself to operate without distractions, the power of those distractions will become weaker and your capacity to focus will become correspondingly stronger. 5. Self-control. Of course, there's a reason why Facebook and YouTube are distracting. It's because they are fun and interesting. I can lose myself for hours surfing on YouTube, following one link to another, and then another. So an essential quality that a law student needs is the capacity to say no to things that any reasonable person would normally want to say yes to. In other words, to be successful, a law student has to be able to defer gratification to put off what is attractive now in order to achieve the sort of success that will allow him or her to obtain even more attractive things in the future. It isn't totally clear whether there is a way to improve your capacity to defer gratification. In 1972, a study known as the marshmallow experiment was conducted at Stanford University. A child would be left in a room with a marshmallow or some other comparable treat and told that if he or she waited 15 minutes without eating the marshmallow, then he or she would get another marshmallow. The children who ate the marshmallow as soon as they were left alone tended to do significantly less well later on in life than the children who were able to put off eating the marshmallow for 15 minutes. This may tend to indicate that the children's capacities for self-control remained unchanged as they grew up. However, the good news is that a very recent study indicates that children's capacity to defer gratification increases, the more certain they can be that deferring gratification will result in their obtaining a reward later. If this is right, then the more often law students see that their long hours of study have resulted in their achieving some concrete reward, the more willing they will be to continue to put the hours in for future rewards. So it may be that a law student can build up his or her capacity for deferred gratification by setting up a program of rewards for him or herself. If I put the hours in this week, I'll reward myself with. But someone who lacks even the capacity to follow through such a program of rewards is unlikely to be able to do well as a law student. 6. Curiosity. Deferring gratification becomes much easier the more motivated you are to study law. Unfortunately, law is such an unfamiliar subject. Any motivation you might have to study it is necessarily weak. You may like the idea of studying law in theory, but a theoretical attraction is hard to sustain when faced with the messy reality of what studying law involves. Most law students discover their motivation for studying law after they have started studying it. They fall in love with the subject and become fascinated with it. But this only happens if they really get stuck into studying law and start grappling with the details of the law instead of remaining content with a more broad brush overview of the subject. As I said in my first letter to you, the law tends to be pretty boring when you view it from a great distance. It's only when you get close up to the law and see it in all its glory that you can give yourself a chance of getting really interested in it. So to do well as a law student, you need to feel driven not to approach the subject superficially, but to try to achieve a very detailed understanding of the law. In other words, you need to feel curious about the law. It is fundamentally curiosity which provides a law student with the initial push that they need to get on the road to success in studying law. If they feel curious about the law, then they will try to understand it in detail. And if they understand it in detail, they will want to know more and more about it. In contrast, someone who just wants to find out enough about the law to get by will never get anywhere in their studies. I assume that being curious about the law isn't really a problem for you. If you weren't interested in finding out more about law, you would hardly be reading this letter. So I don't need to give you any tips on how to overcome a basic lack of curiosity about the law. However, one thing I would advise is that you be careful not to kill your curiosity about law. If you are reading a book about law that bores you, then put it aside. You won't get anything out of it, and it could be very harmful. Some of the books I was told to read before starting to study law as an undergraduate at Oxford were shockingly tedious. But I must have been so excited about the prospect of studying law that didn't put me off. However, you may not be so lucky. So avoid boring books and seek out interesting ones instead. 7. Love of reading. If you study law, you are going to be reading a lot of material. So you have to have a basic love of reading if you are going to be successful as a law student. If reading is, for you, a bore and a drag, then law is not for you. And you should do something that doesn't involve spending so much time with your head stuck in a book, such as science or engineering. Unfortunately, if reading is, for you, a bore and a drag, then there isn't much I can suggest to engender a love of reading for you. Maybe starting to read a lot might help, but it's probably likely to do more harm than good. So I think this is one quality where, if you don't have it, it might be best to think about doing something other than law. 8. Foxiness. In an observation that is now so cliched, you won't be able to believe how much I hate myself for repeating it. The ancient Greek poet Archilochus distinguished between the fox, who knows many things, and the hedgehog, who knows one big thing. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin borrowed the distinction to distinguish between writers, hedgehogs, who attempt to explain the world in terms of one big idea, and writers, foxes, who refuse to view the world in such simplistic terms. Successful law students need to be foxy. They need to know about lots of different things. This is because the law has been, and will always be, influenced by lots of ideas coming from disciplines outside the law, such as philosophy, economics, psychology, political theory, history, even anthropology, that are taken into account by lawmakers in their ongoing conversations about what sort of society we should live in. So if you truly want to understand why the law is the way it is, and to help shape the law in future by contributing to those ongoing conversations, you need to know something about those extra legal disciplines. Let me give you a couple of examples. First, you can't understand why competition law exists or why the law has been reformed since 1925 to make land more marketable without understanding something about economics and how a society's economic health is affected by the existence of monopolies and by rules and regulations which make it hard to trade goods and services in the marketplace. Secondly, recent research in the field of what is called hedonic psychology, basically the study of human happiness, shows that human beings' levels of happiness are resilient. In other words, a human being who suffers an adverse event, such as an injury, soon recovers to the level of happiness that he or she was at before the adverse event. This research may have important implications for the law. For example, if our aim in imprisoning criminals is to reduce their levels of happiness, this research may show that we are imprisoning them for no good reason, as their levels of happiness will, in the long run, be unaffected by their being imprisoned. Again, when the courts order that a defendant compensate a claimant for an injury that the claimant has suffered as a result of the defendant's actions, their aim is to give the claimant enough money to make up for the diminution in their quality of life that the claimant is supposed to have suffered as a result of being injured. However, it may be that there is no good reason for making the defendant pay compensation to the claimant, as the claimant's level of well-being will eventually rebound back to his or her pre-injury levels whether or not he or she is compensated for that injury. So someone who wants to be a successful law student needs to maintain an active interest in other disciplines, such as economics or political theory or psychology. How can you do this? Well, you are living at a very privileged time in human history where you can get a good grounding in the current state of the art, thinking in these disciplines very quickly and very cheaply. You only have to walk into a good bookshop and go to its social sciences section to find lots of very well-written and interesting books about all sorts of topics in politics, psychology, and economics. To give you a guide as to what sort of books you might like to look out for, go to my website, www.mcbridesguides.com. Click on Reading Lists, and then click on Preview. You'll then be supplied with a list of interesting books that you can buy on Amazon, and that deal with issues in politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and thinking skills that are relevant to studying law. You might also be able to get hold of any books that interest you very cheaply on the second-hand books site www.books.com. But Amazon also gives you the option to buy second-hand copies of the books you want. Or alternatively, just wander into a good bookstore and just flick through the books in the social sciences section and see what seems interesting to you. But the important thing is only to read books that interest you. Anything that is boring is simply not going in, and you might as well chuck it and move on to something else. 9. Expressiveness. As I said in my first letter, law is fundamentally a conversation between different lawmakers about what sort of society we should live in. And the study of law is a study of that conversation, where it has got to at the moment, and where it might go in the future. So law is a talking game, and you have to be willing to express yourself if you are going to be able to get anywhere in that game. You have to be willing to express yourself in your written work, in discussing the law with your teachers and fellow students, and in confessing any difficulties you may be having with the work. If you find it hard to open up to other people about what you think, then you are going to find it hard to succeed as a law student. If you are someone who finds it hard to express yourself, then it's probably fear of what will happen if you do tell people what you think or what is going on with you that is holding you back. The only way to overcome any fear is to do the thing you are scared of and see what happens. Almost always, nothing bad will happen, and you'll see that you had nothing to be afraid of. And even if something bad does happen, you'll usually see that what happened wasn't so bad, and not bad enough to hold you back in future from doing the thing you were scared of doing. So if you do find it hard to express yourself, take a leap of faith, say what you want to say, and see what happens. In almost every case, that's all you'll need to do to become more confident about expressing yourself in future. 10. Accuracy. Accuracy is vital to success as a law student. You cannot do well as a law student if you misstate the law where it is clear. or if you apply the law wrongly to a concrete situation, or if your arguments don't stand up to logical scrutiny. Being close to being right is nowhere near good enough in this game. For example, suppose that you are asked to determine whether someone is guilty of murder in the following situation. D sent his enemy, A, a parcel bomb, which was designed to explode and kill A when it opened it. Shortly after he posted the bomb, D repented of his plans and phoned the police to warn them of what he had done. He gave the police detailed instructions as to how to disarm the bomb. B, a member of the bomb squad, was given the job of defusing the bomb, but in doing so he accidentally cut the wrong wire. As a result, the bomb blew up and B was killed. You are told that a defendant will commit the crime of murder if his or her actions cause another to die and he or she performed those actions intending to kill someone or to cause someone to suffer serious bodily harm, and he or she had no lawful justification or excuse for acting as he or she did. You would be amazed, or I hope you would be amazed at how many students your age are incapable of applying this definition accurately to the above situation. Either they say that D is not guilty of murder because at the time B was killed, he did not intend that anyone should die. When the definition makes it clear that it was his intentions at the time, he did the thing which caused someone else to die which count. Or they say that D is not guilty of murder because when D sent the parcel bomb he intended to kill A, not B. When the definition makes it clear that all D has to have intended when he sent the parcel bomb was that someone should be killed or caused serious bodily harm. A student who applied the definition accurately to the above situation would realize that the only real issue here is whether D's sending of the parcel bomb caused B's death. If it did, then all the other elements in the definition are in place. D intended to kill someone when he sent the parcel bomb, and he had no lawful justification or excuse for doing so for D to be found guilty of murder. I think there must be something in the culture in which we live in nowadays that does not encourage the kind of accurate thinking that would allow all students your age to answer the above question correctly. Maybe school children are now led to think that getting close to being right is good enough, or are led to think that what is important is the way they react to a piece of writing, rather than what the piece of writing actually says. Whatever the reason, it is very important that if you are going to be successful as a law student, that you get rid of any bad habits that you have fallen into, which mean that you fail to be clear, logical, and rigorous in understanding the law or in discussing and applying the law. For example, it may be that you are very good at debating, and that has encouraged you to think that you would do very well as a law student. But in fact, debating encourages precisely the sort of inaccuracy that can be fatal to your prospects for success as a law student. This is because debating encourages you to dismiss other people's arguments with flip one-liners that put the other side down. But in law, you have to be much more careful in analyzing other people's arguments and exposing precisely where they have gone wrong. Dismissing someone's arguments in a legal essay with a flip one-liner will result in your being dismissed yourself as a know-nothing dilettante. This isn't to say that if you are good at debating, you won't be a good law student. It just means you have to be careful to be on your guard against bad habits that your success in debating might have led you to acquire. So how do you improve your abilities to be logical and rigorous? Doing logic puzzles, in particular Sudoku puzzles, easily available for free on the internet. Just Google Sudoku puzzles is very helpful. Also, reading books on thinking skills of the types you will find on the book list that I have posted for you on www.mcbridesguides.com will give you some pointers as to common sorts of mental errors that you and other people might tend to fall into. Also, reading beautifully reasoned books will help you think clearly and logically yourself. One book in particular I would recommend is Derek Parfit's Reasons and Persons, Oxford University Press, 1986, a model of clear writing that everyone should seek to imitate. Other writers whose crystal clear prose should encourage you to think clearly and logically yourself are: among law academics, Peter Burks, H. Ella Hart, Philip K. Howard, and Tony Weir. Among thinkers generally, Daniel Kahneman, Peter Kreeft, C.S. Lewis, Peter Singer, and David Stove. Among journalists, Nick Cohen, Theodore Dalrymple, Nick Davies, Ben Goldacre, Clive James, and Bernard Levin. 11. Flexibility. A successful law student will be flexible. He or she will be able to see both sides of an argument. Which is not to say that a successful law student will be incapable of coming to a conclusion as to which side of an argument is stronger. But he or she won't fall into the trap of thinking that only one side of the argument has any merit at all. Consider, for example, the following situation. Peter and Mary are told that their newborn son Adam has a medical condition, which may mean that he needs a bone marrow transplant a few years from now to save his life. Peter and Mary are both tested, but unfortunately their bone marrow would not be suitable for Adam if the need arose for him to have a transplant. So they decide to have another child, in the hope that that child's bone marrow will match Adam's needs. After 3 years of trying, Mary gives birth to a daughter, Eve, whose bone marrow, it turns out, is a match for Adam's. Adam is now 12 and will die without a bone marrow transplant. But Eve is unwilling to undergo the operation, which is painful and difficult, and will require a period of hospitalization for her. There is no other suitable donor available. Should Peter and Mary be allowed to force Eve to have the operation to save Adam's life? If your instinctive reaction is to say, no, Eve has a right not to be made to undergo a medical operation, then think again. The question is whether Eve has such a right, and you cannot answer that question satisfactorily with the mere assertion that she does have such a right. Merely saying that Eve has a right not to be forced into giving up some of her bone marrow is a way of inflexibly closing one's mind down to the possibility that she might not have such a right. So let's not close our minds, but instead consider the possibility that her parents should be allowed to force Eve to have this operation. A good starting point would be to consider whether there are any situations where it seems obvious that Eve's parents should be allowed to force her to have a medical operation. For example, what if Eve has a diseased tooth which needs to be extracted before it causes serious medical problems? But Eve is so scared of dentists, she is refusing to visit one. It seems obvious in this situation that Eve's parents should be allowed to compel her to visit the dentist. But why? Well, in this situation, it seems obvious that the operation would be in Eve's best interests. This gives us some kind of intelligible basis for judging whether forcing Eve to have the bone marrow operation would be justifiable. We can ask whether the operation would be in Eve's best interests. A good law student with the ability to think flexibly will realize that things can be said on both sides of this issue. On the one hand, it would presumably not be in Eve's interests to lose her older brother and all the benefits of his help and companionship. Moreover, it could prove psychologically damaging to Eve to have to live with the knowledge that she could have saved his life, but chose not to. At the same time, it might not be in Eve's interests to be left with the feeling that her parents had no respect for her interests, and that they regarded her as simply a resource to be exploited when the time came that Adam needed what Eve had got. Moreover, the fact that Eve would have to go through the trauma of being physically forced to have the operation might count against our finding that it was in Eve's best interests to go through the operation. The question is finely balanced, but a good law student would realize that, and would not seek the refuge of the false certainty that a bold assertion about Eve's rights affords. If you are someone who finds it hard to see both sides of an issue, you can easily expand this capacity by exposing yourself to alternative points of view. So if you tend to read The Guardian, try to read the Daily Telegraph as well. And if you don't read either, then start making a habit of reading the comments pages in both. Similarly, if you read The Economist or The New Statesman, also read The Spectator or Standpoint. If you are reading a book which advances a particular point of view on some political or social or economic issue, take a note of whose views the book is opposing, and try to read something by the people whose views are being criticized and see what they have to say for themselves. 12. Judgment. It's not enough for a law student to be able to see both sides of a particular issue. A law student also has to be able to judge which side is stronger so as to form a view on that issue. The need for a law student to have good judgment crops up all over the place. For example, if you are taking notes whether in a lecture or on materials you have been told to read, you have to be able to discriminate between what is important and what is not. In order to test your skills at doing this, consider the following passage, which is taken from Frederick Bastiat's pamphlet, The Law, published in 1850. What is law? What then is law? It is the collective organization of the individual right to lawful defense. Each of us has a natural right from God to defend his person, his liberty, and his property. These are the three basic requirements of life, and the preservation of any one of them is completely dependent upon the preservation of the other two. For what are our faculties but the extension of our individuality? And what is property but an extension of our faculties? If every person has the right to defend even by force his person, his liberty, and his property, then it follows that a group of men have the right to organize and support a common force to protect these rights constantly. Thus, the principle of collective right, its reason for existing, its lawfulness, is based on individual right. And the common force that protects this collective right cannot logically have any other purpose or any other mission than that for which it acts as a substitute. Thus, since an individual cannot lawfully use force against the person, liberty, or property of another individual, then the common force for the same reason cannot lawfully be used to destroy the person, liberty, or property of individuals or groups. Such a perversion of force would be, in both cases, contrary to our premise. Force has been given to us to defend our own individual rights. Who will dare to say that force has been given to us to destroy the equal rights of our brothers? Since no individual acting separately can lawfully use force to destroy the rights of others, does it not logically follow that the same principle also applies to the common force, that is nothing more than the organized combination of the individual forces? If this is true, then nothing can be more evident than this. The law is the organization of the natural right of lawful defense. It is the substitution of a common force for individual forces. And this common force is to do only what the individual forces have a natural and lawful right to do: to protect persons, liberties, and properties, to maintain the right of each, and to cause justice to reign over us all, a just and enduring government. If a nation were founded on this basis, it seems to me that order would prevail among the people, in thought as well as in deed. It seems to me that such a nation would have the most simple, easy to accept, economical, limited, non-oppressive, just, and enduring government imaginable, whatever its political form might be. Under such an administration, everyone would understand that he possessed all the privileges as well as all the responsibilities of his existence. No one would have any argument with government, provided that his person was respected, his labor was free, and the fruits of his labor were protected against all unjust attack. When successful, we would not have to thank the state for our success. And conversely, when unsuccessful, we would no more think of blaming the state for our misfortune than would the farmers blame the state because of hail or frost. The state would be felt only by the invaluable blessings of safety provided by this concept of government. It can be further stated that, thanks to the non-intervention of the state in private affairs, our wants and their satisfactions would develop themselves in a logical manner. We would not see poor families seeking literary instruction before they have bread. We would not see cities populated at the expense of rural districts, nor rural districts at the expense of cities. We would not see the great displacements of capital, labor, and population that are caused by legislative decisions. The sources of our existence are made uncertain and precarious by these state-created displacements. And furthermore, these acts burden the government with increased responsibilities. The complete perversion of the law. But unfortunately, law by no means confines itself to its proper functions. And when it has exceeded its proper functions, it has not done so merely in some inconsequential and debatable matters. The law has gone further than this. It has acted in direct opposition to its own purpose. The law has been used to destroy its own objective. It has been applied to annihilating the justice that it was supposed to maintain, to limiting and destroying rights which its real purpose was to respect. The law has placed the collective force at the disposal of the unscrupulous who wish, without risk, to exploit the person, liberty, and property of others. It has converted plunder into a right, in order to protect plunder. And it has converted lawful defense into a crime, in order to punish lawful defense. How has this perversion of the law been accomplished? And what have been the results? The law has been perverted by the influence of two entirely different causes: stupid greed and false philanthropy. Let us speak of the first, a fatal tendency of mankind. Self-preservation and self-development are common aspirations among all people. And if everyone enjoyed the unrestricted use of his faculties and the free disposition of the fruits of his labor, social progress would be ceaseless, uninterrupted, and unfailing. But there is also another tendency that is common among people. When they can, they wish to live and prosper at the expense of others. This is no rash accusation, nor does it come from a gloomy and uncharitable spirit. The annals of history bear witness to the truth of it. The incessant wars, mass migrations, religious persecutions, universal slavery, dishonesty in commerce, and monopolies. This fatal desire has its origin in the very nature of man, in that primitive, universal, and insuppressible instinct that impels him to satisfy his desires with the least possible pain, property, and plunder. Man can live and satisfy his wants only by ceaseless labor, by the ceaseless application of his faculties to natural resources. This process is the origin of property. But it is also true that a man may live and satisfy his wants by seizing and consuming the products of the labor of others. This process is the origin of plunder. Now, since man is naturally inclined to avoid pain, and since labor is pain in itself, it follows that men will resort to plunder whenever plunder is easier than work. History shows this quite clearly. And under these conditions, neither religion nor morality can stop it. When then does plunder stop? It stops when it becomes more painful and more dangerous than labor. It is evident, then, that the proper purpose of law is to use the power of its collective force to stop this fatal tendency to plunder instead of to work. All the measures of the law should protect property and punish plunder. But generally, the law is made by one man or one class of men. And since law cannot operate without the sanction and support of a dominating force, this force must be entrusted to those who make the laws. This fact, combined with the fatal tendency that exists in the heart of man to satisfy his wants with the least possible effort, explains the almost universal perversion of the law. Thus, it is easy to understand how law, instead of checking injustice, becomes the invincible weapon of injustice. It is easy to understand why the law is used by the legislator to destroy in varying degrees among the rest of the people their personal independence by slavery, their liberty by oppression, and their property by plunder. This is done for the benefit of the person who makes the law, and in proportion to the power that he holds. This passage is about 300 words long. Try to summarize it in about 100 words, and then compare your summary with mine at the end of this letter. If you find this exercise difficult, or end up producing a summary that is very different from mine, don't worry about it. Schools seem to have given up on the idea of helping students your age acquire the skill of summarizing long passages. But this is an essential skill that law students need to have, and one you can acquire through practice. Just take any article from a serious newspaper or magazine and try to reduce it to 10% of its length. With enough practice, you will soon acquire a facility for discriminating between what is important and what is not important. This facility is only one side of the general quality of good judgment that law students need to be successful. Another dimension of having good judgment is being blessed with practical wisdom, the ability to know what is the right thing to do when faced with a variety of options. For example, suppose that you are given an essay to do that asks you to suggest some reforms to the law on murder. You have 96 lines, what you could expect to write in the time available to play with. What would it be best to do? 1. Write an essay suggesting 16 reforms, devoting 6 lines to each. 2. Write an essay suggesting 8 reforms, devoting 12 lines to each. 3. Write an essay suggesting 3 reforms, devoting 32 lines to each. Other things being equal, Which essay is likely to impress the examiner the most? The answer is 3. There is no way that you will be able to make out a convincing case for reforming an aspect of the law on murder in 6 or 12 lines, so essays 1 and 2 are going to strike the examiner as being lightweight. Only essay 3 has any chance of getting a high mark from the examiner. A law student who is blessed with practical wisdom will realize this and confine him or herself to suggesting 3 reforms and spend quite a lot of time on each one. A law student who is not so blessed may well decide to adopt a scattergun approach, suggesting lots of reforms, hoping that the examiner will be amazed by his thoroughgoing critique of the law of murder. Sadly, the examiner will probably not be impressed. Summary. So those are the 12 qualities I think a law student needs to be successful. You can see why really good law students are so special. They have a combination of skills which doesn't naturally present in most people. However, most of these skills can be worked on and developed. Hence my point at the start of this letter, that a major reason why it is getting harder to find students who will do very well studying law is that students your age simply don't know what sort of skills they will need if they want to study law, and so don't do enough to help develop those skills. Now that you do know what sort of skills are required, if you do want to study law at university, then work on developing any of the skills that you currently think you are weak on. One last thing, I'm sending you something called a Proust questionnaire. It's a set of questions about you and who you are. The questionnaire is known as a Proust questionnaire because the writer Marcel Proust liked to fill such questionnaires out. Every issue of Vanity Fair now carries a version of a Proust questionnaire with a celebrity. I definitely don't want to know what your answers to these questions are. They are just for you, no one else. I'm enclosing it so as to help you, because I think a lot of young people nowadays, maybe a lot of old people as well, don't have much clue about what's important to them, and what they are good at, and what they want to do. It's important that you do get in touch with what sort of person you are, so that you'll be in a better position to assess whether or not you have the skills needed to be a good law student, and more importantly, whether you have the inclination to do what you need to do to develop the skills required to be a good law student. Doing the enclosed questionnaire is one way of finding out a bit more about yourself, thereby allowing you to get a better idea of whether law is the right subject for you. All best wishes, Nick. P.S. Here is my summary of the passage from Bashchat's The Law. The law exists to protect people's rights to life, liberty, and the enjoyment of their property. If the law simply concerned itself with protecting people's rights, then no one would have any cause to blame the state for his misfortunes, and people would be free to satisfy their needs without any interference from the government. Unfortunately, the law has to be made and enforced by men, and because men are naturally greedy, those who are in charge of the law abuse it to deprive other people of their rights.